Therefore, there exists one singular, necessary, immaterial, timeless, all good, all powerful, all knowing, and infinite cause of the existence of the whole universe and everything in it. And this is exactly what Christians mean when they talk about God. Today I'm going to explain 20 of the most important proofs for the existence of God. To do this, I'm going to look at a helpful list of arguments found in Dr. Peter Kraft and Father Ronald Ticelli's Handbook of Christian Apologetics, and show why these arguments, taken together, create a strong cumulative case for the existence of God. And to make things interesting, I'm actually going to run through this list of arguments backwards. That way, the strongest proofs will actually be at the end of the video. So if you listen to the first few proofs and don't find them convincing, stay tuned to the end. I promise it'll be worth it. Proof number 20. Pascal's wager. To be honest, this one isn't really a proof for God when taken all by itself, but it can be a good starting point for thinking about how much evidence is actually needed for a belief in the existence of God to be justified. Pascal's wager says that even if you're totally on the fence about the existence of God, you're completely split, right down the middle, 50-50, and you just don't know which way to go, it may still be a good idea to believe that God exists. That's because the stakes are much higher if God exists than if he doesn't. If God doesn't exist, then you don't lose anything by believing in him, because when you die, that's it. But if God does exist, then you risk losing heaven by not believing in him, so it's a safer bet to lean toward believing in God if you happen to be on the fence. Number 19. The argument from common consent. Most people throughout history have believed in some kind of religion. Now, it could be that they're all wrong and no religion is true, but doesn't that seem like a bit of a bold claim when put in the context of exactly how many people in human history have been religious? This one doesn't really prove that God exists either, but it does help cast the conversation in a bit of a different light. Number 18. The argument from religious experience. There have been many reports of religious and mystical experiences throughout history. Now, maybe they're all fake. That's definitely possible, but it does seem somewhat unlikely that there would be that many reports of religious experiences in the world if all religions were bunk. While this can't prove that God exists, it does seem to suggest that maybe belief in God isn't so crazy after all. But in my mind, the bigger takeaway from religious experience is that you don't necessarily need a well-formed philosophical argument to believe in God. Some people do, but other people may have reasons to think that God exists that they really can't explain to others, because they're not founded on complex philosophical reasonings, but on personal experience. And I think that's okay. Number 17, the argument from aesthetic experience. Here's what Kraft and Ticelli have to say on this. There is the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Therefore, there is a God. You either see this one, or you don't. So I thought about giving commentary on this one, but seeing as Kraft and Ticelli seemed to think that less was more with it, I figured I'd follow in their footsteps. Number 16, the argument from desire. So at this point, we're still not at the level of fully fleshed out philosophical demonstrations, but we are getting there. This argument traces its origin back to the popular British theologian C.S. Lewis, who put the argument this way. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Man feels sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Here's the idea. Our desires exist for a reason. We don't have a desire unless there is something that can fulfill that desire. But every human being has a fundamental, deep down desire for perfect and complete happiness, the kind of happiness that can't be found anywhere in this world. This suggests that there must be another world where this kind of happiness can exist, the kind of world that could only be created by an all-good and all-powerful God. Numbers 14 and 15, the arguments for morality and conscience. These arguments are pretty similar, so I thought it would be helpful to take them together. The argument for morality starts with the claim that there exists such a thing as objective right and wrong. Not just what's right for you or what's right for me, but an objective good, an objective right and wrong, which is independent of our own personal feelings about morality and applies to everyone. We all act as if this is true. Let's say I called my dog over here. I said, "Here, boy," and he comes over, trotting, obedient dog, and I take his nose and I go wham, and I punch him right in the face. You would tell me that what I did was wrong, because my dog didn't deserve to get punched. He was being a good dog, and I slammed him in the face. And if I told you that my personal sense of morality tells me that punching dogs whenever I feel like it is okay, Well, you would just say that there's something wrong with my personal understanding of morality, that my sense of right and wrong is, well, wrong. That my understanding of right and wrong doesn't match up to what is objectively right and wrong. So there must exist an objective standard for goodness. But how does this standard exist? Is it just something that exists only in our minds? Well, if that was the case, it wouldn't really be objective, because our minds can change. Does it exist like an object floating through space? Well, that doesn't work either, because how can an inanimate object command us to do good and avoid evil? The only other option is for goodness itself to exist immaterially, to exist as a person whose very nature just is to be good, who acts both as a perfect model for goodness and who encourages us to follow in his footsteps. And this is exactly the beginnings of the Christian notion of God. Now, the argument from conscience, on the other hand, just says that anyone who claims to not accept objective morality, because he says morality is just about doing what your conscience tells you to, is actually still accepting objective morality, since he's still accepting everyone must follow his conscience as an absolute principle that everyone must obey. You just can't escape believing in objective morality. Number 13, the ontological argument. Okay, now we're diving into the philosophical deep end. The ontological argument traces its origin back to the 11th century Catholic theologian Saint Anselm of Canterbury, who argued that the existence of God is actually self-evident when we really understand what the term God means. God, Anselm said, is by definition the greatest possible being, or that than which nothing greater can be thought. But a thing is greater, he argued, when it exists in the real world and not just in the mind. So if God existed only in the mind and not in the real world, then there's a greater possible being than him, namely one that exists both in the mind and in the real world. But if there's a greater possible being than God, then he wouldn't actually be the greatest possible being, which contradicts his very definition. Therefore, applying logic to the very definition of God shows that he must exist. Now, it's important to point out that this argument has been questioned even by sympathetic Christian philosophers over the years. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, one of the most important medieval Catholic theologians, rejected the ontological argument, saying it was too bold in proposing a complete definition of God, since God in this life is so far beyond us that we can only get hints at his definition, not a full definition. Still, the argument has had a bit of a comeback in recent years, especially in the more refined modal version of the argument proposed by the 20th century philosopher Alvin Plantinga, which suggested that thinking about God's relationship to possible worlds made the case for God's existence being built into his definition much stronger than even Anselm realized. Number 12, the argument from the origin of the idea of God. This argument was first proposed by the philosopher René Descartes. Descartes, probably most famous today for his "I think, therefore I am" line, began his argument for God in a similar vein to Anselm's, pointing out that we all have within us an idea of God. After all, if we didn't, how could we be thinking about this argument right now? But every idea, Descartes says, must have a cause for its existence in our heads. Most ideas, Descartes argues, were probably just created by us. But this idea of God is unlike all other ideas, because it refers to an actually infinite subject, an actually infinite being, and is therefore an infinite idea. But we know that we are finite, imperfect beings. This raises a question. How could a finite, imperfect being ever create an infinite, perfect idea? After all, no effect is greater than its cause, so no finite cause could ever create an infinite effect. Therefore, there must exist an actually infinite being that put this idea of God, the idea of actually infinite subject, inside all of our heads. And like we already said, an actually infinite being is God. Therefore, God exists. Number 11, the argument from truth. This argument goes all the way back to the thinking of the famous 4th century Catholic theologian St. Augustine of Hippo, who pointed out that our knowledge is universal. Our knowledge applies to different things in different times and places. When I look in my front yard and see a tree, then I have knowledge of what a tree is. But if I look in my neighbor's yard and see a tree, then I have another example of what a tree is. This just means that the concept of tree isn't contained just to my front yard, but exists in many different locations. Indeed, in any location where there's a tree, there exists the concept of tree. But this isn't the only place where the concept of tree exists. It also exists in our minds. But we don't have little trees in our minds whenever we think about trees. Like, there's no physical tree in my brain. Therefore, there must be something immaterial about the idea of a tree. What it is to be a tree doesn't just exist in trees. It also exists as an abstract idea in human minds. But this raises a question. If we all have different ideas about what a tree is, then how do we all know whose idea is the right one? Maybe we'd want to say that we can just look at trees and see who's right about what a tree is, but the problem here is that no tree ever perfectly matches the perfect idea of tree. Every tree is always a tree plus some other attributes that don't properly belong to trees, like being bent to one side or having branches in different spots than other trees, or some other feature. If we tried to use any real-world trees as the ideal standard for what a tree is, then we would necessarily include some things that don't belong to all trees as part of that ideal, and say that all other trees aren't perfectly trees because they aren't exactly as tall as this one tree or have a slightly different number of roots than this one tree. The pure idea of what a tree is then doesn't exist in any one tree, but it exists more like the ideas of trees that we have in our minds. But it can't be the same thing as the ideas of trees that we all have in our minds either, because each of us has a slightly different idea of what a tree is. Also, we human beings aren't eternal. We only exist for a short amount of time. Are we really going to say that what it is to be a tree changes every time a human being dies, or that there was no such thing as a tree before there ever were such things as human beings? To avoid this absurd conclusion, we have to say that our knowledge of trees, and actually our knowledge of anything, exists in a way that's dependent upon a mind far greater than any human mind. A mind that is eternal, and which contains all the perfect ideas of everything that exists, and that we know the truth insofar as the ideas in our mind match that which is in the eternal mind of God. Number 10, the argument from consciousness. This is another one associated with C.S. Lewis. If all that exists is the natural material world, which is very likely under atheism, then all that we are atoms floating through space. But this means that all that our brains are atoms floating through space too. So our minds are just atoms floating through space. The question then is this: why should we trust atoms floating through space to give us an accurate picture of the world? If all of our thinking is done by the brain, and our brain is just this mindless, directionless group of atoms that suggest things to us not based on whether or not these things are true, but based on their value for our survival, then how can we trust that our thinking is really a reliable way to understand the truth? Naturalism, or the belief that all we are is natural material stuff, is ultimately self-defeating because it leaves us with no reason to trust, reason. And if we can't trust reason, we can't trust the arguments that might lead us to accept naturalism. Therefore, naturalism just must be false, and there must exist more than just matter. Indeed, there must exist a divine mind who makes sure that our reasoning is reliable, who creates us with minds that aren't dependent on matter, and this allows us to know that we can trust what reason tells us. Number 10, the argument from miracles. There have been quite a few reports of miracles throughout history, and while many of them may be fake, a lot of them seem to have quite a bit of evidence going for them. The resurrection of Jesus Christ, for example, is a surprisingly well-attested historical event. Many of the Eucharistic miracles throughout Christian history, where the bread used in the consecration of the Eucharist has turned physically into human flesh and blood, have remained remarkably hard to explain scientifically. And the same goes with the purported burial cloth of Jesus, the Shroud of Turin. More recently, the miracle of the sun in Fatima, Portugal in 1917 was witnessed by thousands of people, including atheists, who all reported seeing the sun behaving in extraordinary ways in connection with a report of an apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Now, none of this evidence constitutes conclusive proof that God exists, but it certainly makes it more likely that he does. After all, if even one of the above-mentioned miracles is actually supernatural, then the natural material world isn't all there is. And if that's the case, it's much more likely that God exists, since God is understood to be not part of the natural material world. Also, since many miracles, including the ones I just mentioned, take place in the context of Christianity, the proof of these miracles would act as evidence for the claims of Christianity, which include, among other things, the existence of God. Number 8. The argument from the world as an interacting whole. Now, this argument is a little obscure, but basically it says that everything in the world exists in a complex, interlocking system, so there must be something to unify the system into a coherent whole. This something must be outside the system, or couldn't unify it, and it must be a mind, because you can't unify a system without an idea, and you can't have an idea if you're not a mind. So there must be a mind outside of space and time that unifies all of the connected objects in the world together. Number 7. The argument from contingency. Now, this is one of the classic arguments for God. It has many different forms, but the basic form of them all is this. Premise 1. For everything that exists, there must be a reason for why it exists as it does. Premise 2. There exists in the world something whose reason for its existence cannot be something else in the physical world. Conclusion. Therefore, there must be something outside the physical world to explain the existence of that thing. And when we look at what this non-physical cause must look like, we realize that it also must have all the traditional attributes of God. Different versions of the contingency argument specify different things that must have a cause outside the material world. In many versions of the argument, that thing is the material world itself, taken as a whole. After all, the material world can't explain its own existence since it's contingent. It doesn't have to be, as shown from the fact that all of the stuff inside the material world changes all the time. Everything inside the material world is contingent, so the material world itself must be contingent, and must therefore have its reason for its existence not in itself, but in a cause outside of itself. But if the material world as a whole needs a cause, then that cause can't be inside the material world. That cause must be immaterial, or not made out of matter. But wait a minute, you ask. If everything needs a reason for its existence, what's this immaterial cause's reason for its existence? Doesn't it need an outside cause, like the material world? Well, it would, assuming that that thing was also contingent, like the world and everything in it. But that would only take us back a step further, because we could ask the same thing about the cause of this cause that we asked about the first cause. Eventually, if we're going to have a cause of everything accounted for, we need to arrive at a being that is necessary, a being that doesn't depend on anything else for its existence, a being whose reason for its existence is found in itself, and not in anything outside itself. This could only be the case if the being was changeless, or unable to undergo change. If it was able to change, it would be dependent upon the thing that could change it for its existence, and it wouldn't be necessary. But if that's the case, it must be timeless, since time measures change, and it can't lack anything, since to lack something would allow it to be changed by gaining that something. And that means that this thing must not lack any real perfections, which would include goodness, power, knowledge, and being, which add to the thing which possesses them. After all, if this immaterial necessary cause was missing any of these things, it could be changed by gaining these things. So this thing must be all good, all powerful, all knowing, and infinite. And since there would be no way to distinguish one infinite thing from another infinite thing, there could only ever be one being like this. Therefore, there exists one singular, necessary, immaterial, timeless, all good, all powerful, all knowing, and infinite cause of the existence of the whole universe and everything in it. And this is exactly what Christians mean when they talk about God. Number 6, the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Wow, that last one was a bit of a doozy. I wish I could say it gets easier from here on out, but I can't exactly say that. I mean, I did say these arguments get better as they go on, right? Well, the thing about philosophical arguments is as they get better, they also tend to get more complex. So these next 6 are a bit more on the technical side. But don't worry, I'm going to try to bring these complex ideas down to earth as much as possible. But if you were wondering why the existence of God isn't universally accepted by everyone nowadays, this is why. The arguments for God can be really, really hard to wrap your head around if you're not familiar with philosophy, and not a lot of people are today. The Kalam Cosmological Argument starts with a simple syllogism. Premise 1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Premise 2. The universe began to exist. Conclusion. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. The first premise is kind of just common sense. How could things begin to exist without a cause? If things could begin to exist without causes, then why don't we ever see them doing it? Why do we always naturally assume that there's a cause every time we see something begin to exist? Well, because there always is, of course. Everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The next premise is a bit more controversial. The universe began to exist. The most famous modern-day defender of the Kalam cosmological argument is a philosopher named William Lane Craig, who gives 2 types of evidence for this claim. First, he points to the findings of modern science, including the theory of the Big Bang and the second law of thermodynamics. These scientific theories highly suggest that the universe began to exist at some point, with the Big Bang looking strongly like the moment when the universe began to exist, and the second law of thermodynamics suggesting that if the universe had existed for an infinite amount of time, it should be in a state of disorder today. But scientific evidence is always tentative. So Craig also offers two philosophical reasons to think that the universe had a beginning. Let me give you one of them. Craig argues that an infinite past can't exist because that would entail that an actual infinite exists in the real world, which, he says, is impossible. While Craig grants that something that's potentially infinite can exist in the world, he doesn't think that you could ever have a collection containing an actually infinite number of things in the real world without creating paradoxes. The most famous of these paradoxes is called Hilbert's Hotel. Imagine a hotel where every room is full. If someone shows up at the desk asking to stay at the hotel, he'll be told that he can't, since every room in the hotel is, well, full. Now imagine you had a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, but that every room is still full. In this scenario, if someone came to the front desk and asked to stay at the hotel, he could, even though every room in the hotel is occupied. Well, how's that, you ask? Well, the manager in the front desk could just move everyone up a room. He could move the guy in room 1 up to room 2, the guy in room 2 up to room 3, the guy in room 3 up to room 4, and so on to infinity. That would clear up space in room 1 without kicking anyone out of the hotel, even though every room in the hotel was full before. That's a paradox. How can a hotel be full and still able to accept new guests? On account of paradoxes like these, Craig concludes that you can't have something with an infinite number of parts in the material world. But for there to be an infinite number of past moments implies that time has to have an infinite number of parts. Therefore, the past cannot be infinite. And if the past isn't infinite, then the universe began to exist. And we already said that anything that began to exist must have a cause of its existence. And so the universe must have a cause of its existence. And if the universe has a cause of its existence, that cause must be outside of the universe. It must be outside of space and time. And it also must be really, really powerful in order to be able to create the whole universe and everything in it. And it also must be personal in order to be able to move from acting to not acting. This cause, in other words, must be God. Number 5, the design argument. Now we've moved into some of my favorite arguments for God, the 5 arguments that St. Thomas Aquinas proposed at the beginning of his great work, the Summa Theologica. Now, the most important thing to understand about these arguments is that they each rely upon some more technical metaphysical concepts to get off the ground. These concepts can be a little confusing when you're first learning about them, but when you fully understand what they mean, they're actually pretty intuitive. And I think that's certainly the case about this first of the arguments we're going to talk about. To be honest, I don't really agree with Crafton and Ticelli choosing to call this one the design argument, because there's another very popular argument for God that is usually called the design argument. That argument says that the universe is like a really, really complex machine, and that any complex machine cannot simply come to exist on its own, but must be made by a designer, who must be God. That might be a good argument, but it's not what Aquinas is up to here. Instead, Aquinas takes as his starting point an old philosophical notion called final causality. Final causality basically says that things act with specific ends or goals as their target, whether they know it or not. The heart acts in order to pump blood. A tree drops acorns in order to grow new trees. A rock falls on the ground to fulfill its nature as a rock. Everything has a final cause, and that's why things always behave in consistent ways. They're aiming for their natural ends. But something can't act toward an end unless it's directed by something that has intelligence. Think about an archer shooting an arrow. It's because the archer is aiming his arrow at the target that we say that that arrow is directed toward the target. If the archer just happened to drop his bow by accident and the arrow, shot off in a random direction, then the arrow wouldn't be aiming at its target. The only way, claims Aquinas, that a thing can act toward an end is if it has some intelligence directing it to that end. And while maybe human intelligence might be a good enough explanation for how an arrow ends up directed towards its end, we can't say the same with natural objects, things that humans don't have any control over, like rocks or trees or the heart. Therefore, there must exist a grand intelligence that is able to direct other things to their ends, a thing that has no end of its own because it is already perfect, a perfect divine intelligence. Number 4, the argument from degrees of perfection. We notice things around us that possess qualities to greater or lesser extents. This book here is red, But it's not quite as red as this book right here. I'm tall, but I'm not quite as tall as my dad. You're a loyal viewer of this channel, but you're not quite as loyal as someone who has liked this video and subscribed to the channel. But it's not just height or channel loyalty that comes in degrees. Being, or the quality of having real value, does too. Human beings are more valuable than rats. That's just how it is. That's just true. But if some things are more valuable than others, there must be a standard by which we determine which ones are more valuable. There must be an objective standard for being, like we said back in argument 15 that there was for morality. And just as we said that the objective standard for morality was goodness itself, so the objective standard for being must be being itself, something who exists perfectly without lacking any kind of being. But as we've seen previously, a being which lacks no being is God. Number 3, the argument from time and contingency. We're in the home stretch here. This argument is similar to the contingency argument discussed earlier with a twist. Aquinas presents us with a paradox. Let's say that God doesn't exist. That would mean that everything that exists contingently, that nothing has to be, that nothing is necessary. Now let's assume that the world is eternal. This is where we run into a paradox. If everything is contingent, everything that exists is able to go out of existence. But if everything is able to go out of existence, then given enough time, everything will go out of existence. This presents us with a dilemma. If there's already been enough time for a world full of contingent things to go entirely out of existence, and we live in a world full of only contingent things, then why does the world still exist? After all, once you have a world where nothing exists, you can't ever go back to a world where something exists, since nothing can come from nothing. Therefore, we either have to say that there exists a necessary being that remains in existence even as other things come and go, in which case God exists, or we say that the world hasn't existed for an infinite amount of time, in which case we can use the logic of the Kalam argument discussed a few minutes back to show that there must be a cause of the universe beginning to exist. Either way, God exists. On to the final two. Number 2, the argument from efficient causality. This is the argument most definitive of Thomas Aquinas' philosophy, and one of my personal favorites. This argument starts with an undeniable observed feature of the world, the fact that some things cause other things to exist. Kraft and Ticelli give the example of a man playing the piano. That man is causing the music to come out of the piano. It's only because he's sitting there pressing keys that the piano is making music. If he got up and walked away, the music would stop. But what Kraft and Ticelli argue is that everything in the physical world is kind of like the piano music. Everything in this world needs a cause to explain its existence. That's because everything in this world has a distinction between its essence and its existence. A distinction between what that thing is and the fact that that thing is. We know this is the case because we can understand what a thing is without all of a sudden knowing that a thing is. Imagine you knew nothing about animals, and I told you about 3 animals: dogs, dinosaurs, and unicorns, and gave you all the information about these animals you would need to have a complete grasp of their nature, a complete grasp of what they are. So if you saw a dog or a unicorn or a dinosaur, you would know instantly which one is which. But notice that in this situation, where you know everything there is to know about what these animals are, you wouldn't know, just from knowing that, which of these animals actually existed. You wouldn't know, for example, that a dog is an animal that exists now, a dinosaur is an animal that used to exist but doesn't anymore, and a unicorn is an animal that has never existed. You can know everything there is to know about an animal's essence without knowing about its existence. This suggests that there is a real distinction between a thing's essence and its existence, that these things are really distinct. So when a thing is caused to exist, that means that something is putting its essence and its existence together, that something is giving its essence existence. But what is it that puts a thing's essence and existence together? It can't be the thing itself, because that would mean that a thing was causing itself, which doesn't make any sense. So maybe it's another thing that has a distinction between its essence and existence. This works at first until you realize that we can ask the same question about that thing that we asked about the first thing. Namely, what's giving it existence? Unless we want to do this back to infinity, we have to say that there exists something which has no distinction between its essence and its existence. Something whose essence just is to exist, so it doesn't need to be given existence by anything else. Something whose very nature just is to be. Something who can truly say, as God said to Moses in the burning bush, "I am that I am." And if you want to learn more about this argument, I recommend you check out the video I have on it up on my channel, titled Aquinas' Argument for God Explained. Actually, this would be a great time to mention that I have videos explaining most of the more complicated arguments for God we've gone over today up on my channel. So if you find these summaries a little too short and wish for more depth, you may want to consider going over to my channel pages and looking through some of the content I have there. And again, if you could consider subscribing to help this channel grow, I would really, really appreciate it. Now, finally, on to our final argument for the existence of God, the argument from change. I'm glad we get to end on this one, because this is really perhaps the most important argument for God historically. The origins of this argument go all the way back to Aristotle, who lived centuries before the birth of Christ and the beginning of Christianity. Despite being raised in ancient Greece and knowing only pagan religions, Aristotle reasoned his way to the conclusion that there must exist a perfect, unmoved mover to explain the behavior of things, and especially the existence of change as a real feature of the world. Later Christian thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas saw in Aristotle's unmoved mover an early attempt to describe something that looks a lot like the perfect, unchanging God of Christianity, and showed how the unmoved mover that Aristotle described must have other traditional attributes of God, like being all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful, to really be an unmoved mover. So this was a good place to end a summary of the most important arguments for the Christian God. After all, this argument is ancient, predating even Christianity itself. This is how Criefton Ticelli introduced the argument. The material world we know is a world full of change. This young woman came to be 5'2", but she was not always that height. The great oak tree before us grew from the tiniest acorn. Now, when something comes to be in a certain state, such as mature size, that state cannot bring itself into being. For until it comes to be, it does not exist. And if it does not yet exist, it cannot cause anything. All this is pretty commonsensical. Things change, obviously. If I move my hand from here to there, that's a change. If I stand up and walk around, that's another change. But things can't change themselves. When something changes, it gains actuality or realness. When I get up and walk around, the state of affairs where Thomas Cahill is up and walking around becomes actual rather than merely potential. But to gain actuality, something must be given actuality by another thing. Nothing can give what it does not have. If you asked me to give you $100 for you to invest in the stock market, I couldn't give that to you unless I had the $100 myself. You can't give what you don't have. And so since the state of affairs where I'm walking around the room doesn't have actuality already, it can't give itself actuality. That means it must get actuality from something else. So nothing can change itself. When things change, they change because they're being changed by something outside themselves. Now let's say that these changing things are being changed by other changing things. Okay, now we have to ask what's changing those things. Let's say it's other changing things. The problem with this explanation is that those changing things would themselves have to be changed by other changing things. And if everything that exists is a changing thing, this could go back to infinity. But it can't go back to infinity. You can't have an infinite number of changing things giving actuality to other changing things, because there would be no way to explain where this whole actuality thing is coming from in the first place. Therefore, there must exist something that changes other things without itself being changed. Something that gives actuality without itself being actualized. A purely actual actualizer, or an unmoved mover. An unmoved mover that can't change and is therefore outside of time, which is a measure of change. An unmoved mover that is immaterial, since matter is always changing. An unmoved mover that is infinite, because if it wasn't, it would lack something and would be able to change by gaining whatever it lacked. An unmoved mover, in other words, that is exactly the same being that these other arguments for God arrive at. An infinite, all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing, immaterial, timeless, unchanging, personal cause of all that is. A being to which Christians for millennia have given the name of God. And those are 20 of the most important philosophical arguments for God. What's most interesting, I find, is how they all come together, how they all arrive at the same being from different angles. Granted, some of the arguments were stronger than others. I don't think many people are going to find the argument from desire, for example, very convincing, if taken all by itself. But we don't have to take these arguments by themselves. They build on each other, with some of them filling in the holes that might be in other ones. If you had a bucket with a hole on one side, How do you use it to carry water? By putting another bucket over it. And if that bucket has a hole, you just make sure that the two holes aren't overlapping, and you'll still be able to carry water quite effectively. In the same way, if one of these arguments doesn't seem totally convincing to you, look at it in the context of the other arguments. Ask yourself if it really seems plausible that all of these arguments have major holes in them, and that atheism is really a better explanation, in the light of all of these arguments, of what we see in the world than theism. That's my challenge for you anyway. I hope by this point in the video that you can at least understand why Christians claim that the existence of God can be known by reason alone. The case for the existence of God, when taken all together, is really quite strong. Thank you for watching this video, and God bless.